And it looks like we are live. Fantastic. We had a couple of false starts, but I'm so happy to be here today. Both Janelle and I are co-hosting the Worldschool Education Live series, and today I am speaking with Stephanie Sewell. Did I pronounce your last name correctly? Sewell?
Very close. Sewell.
Sewell.
Like Jewel.
Oh, I will always remember that. Perfect. Stephanie is an independent education consultant, and I had the pleasure of meeting her through one of the Arrow Education Live Zoom calls, and I was so impressed with her approach. And so I invited her on to speak with us and speak with our group about the work that she does. And I think it's really a fascinating approach. The first question that I want to just dig right in is on your website. The first thing we see is this statement: I help children and teens look at their education through a new lens, a lens of ownership. Owning their learning allows young people to build engagement, happiness, and confidence in all aspects of life. Could you go ahead and share with us a little bit about what that means and how you do that?
Absolutely. So owning your learning to me means that you feel empowered to take a leadership role. This might mean that you attend an extremely traditional school. It might mean that you homeschool using a curriculum. It might mean that you don't go to school and you're more of an unschooler. It can mean anything to somebody who's looking at it, but the commonality is that inside you feel that you've made a choice to be where you are and that you are in agreement with learning in the way that you're learning. And I think that's so important because when kids understand that authentic learning and that ownership, it sets them up incredibly well to move through their teenage years and into adulthood. Because as adults, we really want to understand that we can make choices for ourselves and that we have the ability to jump out there and find the things that we need. One of the ways that I talk about it as well is to give a really clear image of the notion of owning your learning. If you think of a baby who's just getting ready to learn to walk, they're just about to shift into that toddler phase. Imagine what they're like. You know, they're pulling themselves up on a table. They're so determined. They keep doing it. They keep trying. And you're there as their parent, just like almost bursting with excitement. And that's a natural learning moment. They are absolutely owning their learning. You didn't have to tell them that it was the day to learn to walk. It's just happening naturally, and you're instinctively facilitating and supporting that. And that's what almost all learning can look like.
Okay, so I've heard this as an example of we don't teach our children to walk, we don't teach our children to talk. If we agree with that and recognize that, are we to believe that a natural function of, say, the brain or the biology of a human being is to learn?
I believe so. And I think you referred to Arrow earlier, the Alternative Education Resource Organization. And one of the things we hear the most often in there is children are natural learners. And I think that most parents or most adults could accept that. You know, we know that kids go out and they learn to climb a tree or they learn to do whatever. I mean, we can all give lots of examples of play type of learning. And where we're challenged is to apply that idea of natural learning to what we're used to thinking of as connected to school, to academic learning. And so that's where the conversation becomes really interesting.
So, in your opinion, what is, now I'm asking for your opinion, not from a historic or political perspective, but in your opinion, what is the purpose of education?
Yep. I love that question, and I love conversations about that. And I think it's such a great question for adults to ask themselves because it really brings, it allows you to get in touch with a lot of important concepts that you have inside that you may not be aware of. So I believe that education is the process that people go through as they learn to live well. And you'll notice that I often say people, I don't say adults and children or babies and teens. I'll often use people, and I do mean people with that. Education is something that we're all involved in, no matter what age we are. So by live well, I mean things like being happy, being healthy, being independent, things like being able to contribute to your community, things like being able to adjust and flow within the circumstances of life that you find yourself. For example, managing lockdown under a pandemic. It's this process of education that we are in or have been in is part of what allows us to get there. So to me, it's a very broad notion. And with that idea of it being so broad, we can look at it as much more than academics, because there's so much more that we need to be well able to step into our adult life.
So, what role does curriculum play in education from your perspective?
Curriculum is the pre-planned way of learning certain things. So for example, say you wanted to be a surgeon. It's a really good idea to follow a curriculum to become a surgeon, because, you know, there's a lot of really specific stuff that you need to know how to do in order to be a surgeon. And you want to, as the person who's going to be the surgeon and as the person who's going to be receiving the skills of the surgeon, you want to know that they've learned a body of knowledge that surgeons have agreed is necessary. So that's, to me, that's what curriculum is that idea of a body of knowledge that we realize is necessary for something that we want to do. So where I think curriculum gets tricky is what it's become so broad and so all-encompassing that we are asking people between the ages of 6 and 18 to learn an incredible amount of stuff, a lot of which they won't use in their adult life, or or a lot of which they're maybe not interested in learning. And we're used to thinking of this as a norm, which can be problematic, because we then get into things where kids are not enjoying school, or they're not liking it, or they're struggling. And it's important to, in that case, be able to look at the curriculum itself and say, okay, well, how is the child engaging with that? And is that part of what the problem is?
So, you as an educational consultant generally I'm assuming you come in to work with families and students when there is a problem. And is that primarily a problem within a conventional system, or is that just sort of an overall homeschooling problem? What is the balance or the ratio of homeschooled versus traditionally schooled folks that you deal with?
So I often am brought into a family at the moment of transition. So when things have been challenging in school, perhaps a young person is dealing with anxiety and depression, and they're really feeling that they're not able to go to school. We have this term school refusal, which is such a clear way of putting it. It's a child who's just not able to go for whatever reason in that moment. So that's often where I come into a family. And my role then becomes to help them see that there is a way of living without school. It can be a very good way of living. It can still allow you to go to college, to go to university, to be educated, and to help them kind of see what that world is and how to step into it. The other families that I will often work with are families who are already homeschooling and doing fine, but looking for some guidance with how to do it.
So our community is unique in the sense where there's, in normal times, they're stepping into an alternative lifestyle So there's already that buy-in. There may not be the buy-in from the children because in some cases they're not quite sure what to expect, and so all they know is they're transitioning from one lifestyle to a lifestyle of travel. In terms of the families, again, in normal times, um, that are within our community, what would you say to them about making this transition where not only the educational portion looks different, but the whole world and the whole way of being as a family looks different?
So I would say a couple of things. I think that as parents, our role in the family is to hold the space for our family and each member of it to thrive as best we can. We have that, that's kind of the bottom line of what we do. And I think that that can apply to education as well. So that if you're moving into kind of doing schoolwork, whatever, however it looks for your family, within your family as you're traveling, just be ready to hold that. And think by holding the family, we're looking at things like, what are your routines? What are your rhythms? What are the times in your day that make you laugh? What are the times in the day that make you feel connected? When are your kids excited and inspired about learning something? So it's really important to start noticing those. As parents, you want to just like think about what makes your kids tick. You know, when did all those things show up? And then you start building on those. And at the same time, be aware of the idea of deschooling. Deschooling is the word that we use to refer to that time of kind of leaving behind like school as we normally or traditionally think of it and stepping into living without school. And deschooling is a process because it's a huge change. When we're in school, we get up every morning, we have to be there at a certain time. There's a bell, we're told we have to ask to go to the bathroom, we're told when to eat, we're told when to play, we're told what to learn, we're evaluated. It's a whole world. So we need time to kind of remove some of that and start to emerge with our own agenda a little bit more. So that's an important thing for parents to realize will happen with their kids, and it's happening with kids all over the world right now. There is a period of adjustment. So to accept that there will be a period of adjustment, get used to looking for what makes your kids thrive, and then start kind of crafting your days around whatever schooling you want to do within there as well.
And do you feel that families should define what education means as a family? Or is this something that should be taken from some standard definition, that has been practiced for years?
That's a great question. I think that I think it's a useful exercise to go through, certainly for the parents, and depending on the age and the personality of the kids, quite likely for the kids as well. And I think the reason it's so important is because we have so much stress is brought into families, particularly homeschooling families, about, oh, like, they're not doing enough work, and, all they do sometimes is play all day, and like, I was tired today, so I couldn't teach them. And like, we've got a lot of angst and, negative energy that's around that kind of stuff. So if we can be clear on the big picture of what we're at, what we're about, what education means to us, and what we want to facilitate for our kids as they grow up and begin to make their own way in the world, I think it can take away a lot of that pressure, which ultimately allows your kids to thrive and be educated better anyway. So it's kind of a win-win.
I love that. And what age do you think is appropriate to start having these conversations?
Well, I think it's always appropriate in an age-appropriate way. I know that if you think about a 5-year-old who's looking around at their peers, at whether they're traveling the world or whether they're living in a community, they're aware that 5 years old-ish is when kids start to go to school normally. So depending on the personality of that child, they may be very much wanting to go to school. You know, there's often a joke in homeschooling families that they realized that really what their child wanted to do was ride the school bus. So they arranged for them to have one ride on a school bus and they were done. That was good. They didn't want to go to school anymore. But all that to say that no matter how old you are, you're aware of what other people are doing. So I think that it's important to be open as a family about why you're doing things the way you're doing it. You know, what right now at 5 years old, we're staying home because like we have these great kids that are home as well, and I just want you to have time to play. And yeah, when you're ready to start learning to read, we can totally do that together. You don't have to be in school to read. And you know, if you've got in your mind that, like for me, I really wanted my kids to be home till grade 4 at least. So I would, you know, that was something that came up. It's like, yeah, you know, once you get to the age of grade 4, if you're still interested in going to school, or if you want to go to school at that point, go for it. Then it becomes your choice to make that decision. For now, we are going to stay outside of school. We're going to learn in these other ways. But then you realize what your kids' needs are. And if it's a need for social learning, then you're going to facilitate that for them by some kind of little co-op experience or whatever it is, whatever's appropriate to your reality.
And I just a quick little side note for those of you that are watching live in the Facebook group, always, as always, feel free to ask questions and we'll interject and hopefully get to answer those for you. So I was wondering if you could help us out and maybe define the difference between homeschooling and self-directed education. In many conversations, I hear those terms being used as, you know, as the same thing, but are they indeed the same thing?
Yeah, it's so to me, those two terms are not synonymous, but I would start my first point for answering that question is in inviting people to consider what the word homeschooling means. It's probably the most widely used term to describe this kind of thing in the world, but I think that it carries with it the assumption that there's school-like learning going on at home. And you know, you mentioned to me the term unschoolers earlier, and that's, you know, that's another term that we can throw in there. So to say that people who choose not to participate in school might be doing a lot of stuff at home that looks like school. That's kind of one way of doing it. And you have a spectrum right along to not doing anything at home that looks like school unless the child initiates it. So in terms of those terms, I talk about living without school rather than homeschooling. So once you step into living without school, you have self-directed learning, which is kind of that idea of unschooling, and you know, it's really coming from the child. Or you have what people will often call more school at home, or I would say, you know, curriculum-based learning, things like that, and everything in between. Lots of combinations thereof.
And so for the self-directed approach,
Yep.
can you describe what that looks like a little bit for the children, from the learner's perspective, and then we'll jump into the parent's perspective in terms of supporting that?
For sure. So from the child's perspective, self-directed learning looks like the age-appropriate version of learning to walk. So kids, no matter what age they are, they've got ideas in their head about what they want to learn. They've got something they're intrigued by, something they're passionate about, something they're obsessed about, and they know how to learn. So self-directed learning looks like you have the opportunity and the support around you to go learn that. As an older kid, perhaps a teen, self-directed learning may well look like some book stuff. It might look like an online course. It might look like preparing for SATs. Because at that point, maybe you've decided, you know what, I think I do want to be a surgeon. And I've taken that goal of being a surgeon and I've mapped it back. And I see that I'm going to need to go to university. And this is what I have to do to go to university. So that self-directed learning starts to look a little bit like schooling at home, but it's different because the child, teen has initiated it. They're choosing to do it and they're choosing to walk along that path. So it really varies according to age and according to the interests of the child. But it's really that idea that they have space and and the opportunity to do what makes sense for them.
I'm I, I'm going to follow up with how parents can support that in just a moment. But as a world schooler, and right now, obviously, we're all grounded, but this will stay in our archives and hopefully will be a great resource once we get back out into the world. I traveled with a team for, during his whole adolescence. There wasn't, a time where my son was an adolescent and we weren't traveling. And learning looks really different in the world, right? And so part of, and especially with a combination of travel, it's, are you engaged? Are you not engaged with what we're doing? And even when they're not engaged, are they absorbing and learning? Sometimes as a parent, my own deschooling process was breathing into the frustration where I didn't feel like my child was engaged. And this amazing thing that we were experiencing right in front of us, the Panama Canal, the locks going up and down, and yet he's on his phone. But sometimes, learning looks different in different circumstances. And can you address that a little bit? Because I do know the example that I just gave, even though my son at some point was on his phone, like a month later, we had this incredible conversation about the engineering of it all. And in my mind, he wasn't paying attention. In his mind and in his experience, paying attention looked very, very different, and the learning process looked very different for him than what I, as parent, expected.
Yep. Yeah, I can totally relate to what you're saying, and you're reminding me of, like, we've traveled a lot as a family in Europe, and car trips where the kids are in the back seat and we're saying, like, look at this, look at this, look at this, and they're on their phones, and you just feel like banging your head against the window and going home. So I know exactly how the kind of feelings that you're relating. So I think there's a couple of things. We can always bring that type of experience back to a conversation. So, in that situation that I just mentioned, my kids in that moment just needed a bit of downtime. They were peripherally aware of what was going on, but they did not feel like engaging. We'd just come away from staying with relatives, and they just needed a bit of space in their own heads. And for them, their own heads, their phone was an extension of that in that moment. So if you're in that place of feeling like your child is just not engaged, that's the first thing I think to do, is to take a step back, and can you initiate a conversation about how they are experiencing it? Or maybe you don't even need to initiate that conversation. Maybe by taking a breath and taking a step back, you'll realize that they are present in the way that they're able to be in that moment. And so then part of that, of course, is recognizing that when we travel, it can be a lot of stuff coming in. It's, there's a certain energy to being in new places and seeing new things, and we will engage with that differently at different times. And as you discovered on the Panama Canal, being on your phone but still aware can be a very, very deep way of experiencing something as well.
Yeah, and I do say for me that was an epiphany that I don't need to worry.
Yeah.
That the world is teaching, that there is an interaction, even though it may look different than what I imagined it should look like, and I had to let go of that.
And I think as well that it's interesting. It's if you take that idea of, maybe I shouldn't worry, and put that back to your child as a self-directed learner, as somebody who's preparing his own life or living his own life, then we can think, try to put words around this thought. It's almost like it's a curriculum, right? Like we can, I think from our family trips in Europe, in some ways it's a curriculum, because we're saying, we're going to go here, we're going to see that. And as parents, we've got kind of an idea about what our kids will learn and gain from that experience. And anytime that we're offering somebody an experience, it's very easy for us to get absorbed in what our own expectation is and kind of squash out their flame by getting too much in their face in a way. So I think that idea of saying, you know what, I'm offering this experience of going through the Panama Canal or driving through the back roads of Poland, but what the other person gets out of it is up to them. So it's like you're putting that experience out there, you're engaging with it one way, they're engaging with it another way, and they get to own their experience. And if we can accept that, then they will be more present, because they'll as they step out, they'll be able to be in the experience and not fighting with us.
Absolutely. And I often talk about, going to a city or going to a location, and we all look at it through our own lenses. And one person may see the fashion, and another person may see the ecology, and yet a whole another person will see the history.
Yep.
And it's the same place. And I think that's what's so magical about the immersive experiential learning as a family.
Yeah, and the conversations afterwards are often what brings the other perspectives to each individual.
Absolutely.
Having that strong connection with your kids is so important, because then the conversations can come.
Exactly. And the conversations are what make the learning rich.
Yeah.
So, to back up a little bit, my follow-up question that I said I was going to ask you, we sort of talked about it, but I wanted to see if there was anything else that you wanted to add to the question of how do parents support self-directed learning in general, and then possibly on the road.
Yeah, so I think that, as you said, we've touched on a lot of pieces of it. I think that probably the most important thing to recognize is that this deschooling process is essential, because it's by peeling away all the layers that the child's self-directed learning can start to emerge. One of the things that you really need to pass through is boredom. Boredom births wonderful stuff. As long as we're doing and thinking and being required to do this and this and this, it's hard to allow new thoughts to come out. So boredom is okay, and boredom is even good. I think it's really important as a step towards self-directed learning. And as I mentioned just now, the idea of not squashing their fires. Provide opportunities, but let them own it. Let them continue to lead the way. It's the example of, another example for that is, the child who says, I really want to learn to play piano. And the parent's like, yes, awesome, I'm going to sign you up with the world's greatest piano teacher, and away we go. And the child, 2 lessons in, realizes, oh, I'm supposed to practice scales and learn to read those black dots on the page, and I have to do it for 15 minutes every day, and whatever it means. And suddenly they realize they're not wanting to do it anymore. And then the parent is faced with well, I signed you up, you wanted this, but it wasn't what the child thought it would be. So it's that idea of opening opportunities, but being ready to adjust quickly as you go.
It's funny. I used to host a conversation-based podcast about alternative education, and I've done a 2-hour episode on being bored, and I've done a 2-hour episode on quitting. I mean, there's so much we can talk about on those 2 topics alone, but I'm so glad that you brought those things up.
Yeah.
They're really important aspects to empowering a self-directed learner, aren't they?
Yep. Yeah, and because just the word quitting, I was talking to a teen that I work with, we were talking the other day about the idea of dropping out, quitting school. And we were saying how much negative connotation that carries, and how, if that's what you feel like you've done, you've quit piano or you've quit school, all the conversation is around what you're not doing. Whereas if we could start talking about dropping in to life or exploring piano through improvisation at the keyboard instead of quitting lessons, that those words, both for the parent or the observer and the person themselves, it's completely transforming, completely transformative. If you don't have to deal with all that negative, defending yourself against people who think you've dropped out and you're not doing anything, or you're a quitter, like, to be able to talk about the ways in which you're a doer instead, and just let all that other stuff just fade away. Sorry, my hand's over here going.
And it's just simply, I say simply, but it takes practice, but it's reframing the conversation.
Yeah.
And I would even venture to say that that's what Worldschoolers have practiced doing, because we have the opportunity to see the world through different worldviews and different perspectives. So I think, empowering the families to be able to apply that to their own family's learning is one of those things that comes naturally to the practice world schooler.
I think that's a really great point. That's a really great point. And the beauty of like the Facebook group that you've created with that, it allows people to see what they're doing as not just them. Like there's, ironically, there's a loneliness to being out in the world as a traveling family, because your connections are different. And so having that community is super important. And I bring it up because it's also super important when you're practicing education differently. It's important to normalize it for yourself as a parent, to normalize it for your kids, and to get ideas from other people. To know things like, well, my kid just keeps starting things and quitting. Like, well, maybe there's some other parent out there who's going to say to you, actually, they're just exploring. And it can be as simple a sentence as that just switches it around from a negative to a positive for you, which is of massive benefit to your family as well.
Yeah, I totally agree. So the next question that I'm going to ask you, I know the answer is deschooling, but I know this is what you're going to say, but I think it's important to bring up. As we're talking about reframing conversations, as a parent who haven't gone through the deschooling process and we want to jump from a school way of learning in our mind into world schooling or even homeschooling, self-directed learning as it supports the world schooling process, how can parents stop or transition out of the role of being the teacher or the exam giver or the enforcer of schedules? And those are the paradigms that we're accustomed to in another world.
Yeah, and you're right, deschooling is the answer. How do you do that within deschooling is what we can talk about. So I think a lot of it depends on the individual family circumstances and the child. If you're, for example, say you have a child who's, I don't know, maybe 9 and feeling quite anxious about this idea of stepping aside from their home-based life and moving into a world schooling scenario, having that child, offering that child the opportunity to keep doing the schoolwork that they're used to might be a really, really important kind of unifying factor between the life at home and the life on the road. So having them have the opportunity to do that work could be really, really, really helpful for them. Another child at that age who's like, no school? Awesome! I'm all into this. Just don't do any schoolwork at all. That child's like ready to go with exploring. So as far as deschooling, I think it can look very different depending on the family. But if you're the family that is thinking, yeah, I think my child kind of needs to do this schoolwork, I'm going to feel better if I see that they're still doing math. It's okay, be gentle with yourselves. Start out like that, but know that it's something that will most likely shift before you're done. It might be that you'll do math out of a book for a few weeks, and then, you know, maybe as everybody's getting adjusted, the objections will start coming. Oh, do I have to do it today? And that's where a conversation comes up of, yeah, well, you know, you were in grade 4 and you were still doing this book, so how are you feeling about it? Like, you could decide to finish it or not. Like, this is how it looks if you don't do your math book at the time that you decide you want to learn math. You'll learn it in the way that makes sense for you at that time. Lots of kids have done this. There's no obligation for you to follow a math curriculum. You'll be okay no matter what. But if you want to keep on going and be able to like connect with your friends at home and say, oh yeah, you know, I hate long division as well, that's fine too. So it's being flexible, being open, and understanding that there are many, many ways of successfully moving into whatever path your child will take as an adult.
One of my good friends who is an advocate for unschooling loves talking about math. She loves talking about it. And she says that she's a grandmother, and she says, oh, world schoolers, you've got the best ability, the best circumstances to learn math. Give your kids the budget for a month and they'll figure out everything that they need to know about math. So in terms of world schooling, give them real money.
Yep.
You know?
It's so true. And I would add to that, make sure to listen to your kids. Because if you're saying, here's the budget for the month, you're responsible for it, and in your brain you're thinking, this is so cool, like this is their math. And if the child is receiving that with anxiety because there's only this amount of money, and what if they screw it up? Are you going to have enough money for a meal? Like whatever's going on with the child, that might not be the right math thing for that child at that time. So it always comes back to offer opportunities, create opportunities, but recognize that your child has to, your child's right to engage with that is as important as your desire to offer it.
Absolutely. And conversation and connection are always at the root of that. I
For sure.
absolutely agree. So, what do you think the biggest challenges teen learners face?
Yeah. So teen learners are in a stage where they're starting to be ready to step out into the world. There's, you know, they're, as a 2-year-old is always saying, mine, I'm going to do it by myself. Teens are saying that in a different way as well. And this is absolutely appropriate and wonderful and exciting to witness. Teens who are not in school often experience some anxiety around, well, how do I go to college? How do I go to university? How do, you know, I have to do that. You know, they've kind of wrapped their head around the idea of homeschooling, being out of school for those years. But to be out of school for the university years, like, what does that look like? Is that even a thing? Like, if I want to go, how do I? Don't have marks, don't have a transcript. So I think that's a really big challenge. Teens and parents can make that process smoother by informing themselves about what the options are. So, you know, going back to our budding surgeon, you know, if they will have to go to university, so depending on where they're going to go to university, what is the process for getting into that university? Different universities have different ways of accepting homeschoolers, but all of the big universities are like reaching out and seeking homeschoolers now because they see something different there. They see a spark for learning. They see an ability to manage their time, an ability to self-direct. You know, whether they're unschoolers or they're people who are doing curriculum at home, they still have this ability to self-direct. And I imagine that would be particularly the case for people who are coming out of a world schooling experience. You know, they really know how to manage themselves in all kinds of situations. So it is possible to go to university, just figure out what it is you have to do what you want to do at university, and then do it. And it is possible to move into any other kind of adult life. So talk to people who are in those roles. You know, if you want to be an entrepreneur of some kind, find somebody who's doing that, talk to them and seek their advice about how to manage the time that you're in right now. And of course, the other thing for teens traveling is the challenge of being with their family 24/7, if that's the reality. That, you know, that's not easy. And again, as parents who are used to being attuned to our kids' needs, we'll recognize that. You know, you'll find solutions. I have a friend whose family traveled in Africa for 5 months when their daughter was 14 or 15 and had a younger sibling as well. And what they were sleeping in a tent on top of their Jeep. And she never, ever, ever had time alone because she couldn't sit outside at night. There were huge animals around and it wasn't safe. And what they wound up doing was saying for half an hour every evening, they suspended a piece of material in the middle of the tent, and her side was one side and everybody else stayed on the other side. And it gave her some sense of privacy for that time. So as parents who are connected with our kids and creative, we really will find ways to offer the teens what they need, and the teens will find ways to ask for it.
Yeah, I know that one.
Yep, me too.
um, could you give us any final thoughts about transitioning, maybe taking what we're learning from this time of uncertainty, a time where everything is locked down and we are stationary and everything looks different? How do we take what we've learned and gained from that into a new world, into a new way of being? How do we transform and reframe that into something that will fuel us as we move through the world in the future?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I hope that a lot of people all around the world are asking themselves that question. So I live in Quebec in Canada, and the schools are actually going back starting next week. So we're kind of at the forefront of this. I don't know whether it's a good idea or not, but it is happening. And it's interesting to see already the way people are starting to react to that. Some are jumping right in, others are saying no thanks. So I think that it's really important to take some time to reflect on what your experience has been right now, and in a way that's appropriate to your child, invite them to do the same. I know that I'm benefiting from not running out the door every day. I'm feeling a piece of, okay, I just know where everybody is because everybody's here. Like I appreciate that quiet in my brain. Obviously, it won't remain like that, but noticing what's been a positive thing for you, what has fueled your well-being right now, write it down. Write it down somewhere so that you can go back to it when we're into whatever our new normal is, and you're starting to feel whatever it is, and you're feeling like, oh, I didn't used to feel like that. You want to be able to go back and read the words of what it was that felt good now, or that felt positive now. And I think that no matter how different kids are engaging with any academic work they're doing right now, it is different than when they're in school. So again, notice, if your teacher, if you're connected with a school somehow or some kind of online learning, and their requirements of you have changed due to the pandemic, how are you experiencing that? Is it better? Is it worse? Notice that. You can learn something really important about yourself, which allows you to move forward with a clarity that normally we don't get.
Thank you. And I always invite families to just stay in conversation.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you. And Stephanie, where can people find you online? And I will put your links in the broadcast once this is.
For sure. So I'm online in a few different spots. My website is stephaniesewell.ca. And my Facebook page, if you search Stephanie Sewell Education, then it will pop up. And I also, at the beginning of this whole pandemic, I started a group called Unexpected Homeschooling. So that's a Facebook group that you're more than welcome to become a part of. And in there, I'm starting to do some lives in there, and there's conversation and advice and support in there as well. And I'm always more than happy to have somebody reach out to me via email. It's stephaniejsewell@gmail.com. And that information, of course, is on my website as well. So happy to connect at any time.
Thank you so much, and I really enjoyed speaking with you today. And I just loved when I first met you your intuitiveness about learning and about supporting the student is so deep, which is why I invited you to come in and speak with our community. And I do highly recommend, if you are searching for somebody to work with as an educational consultant, I do recommend Stephanie. So
Thank you so much, Lainey. It's been a real pleasure to speak with you and to, through you, get to know your community a little bit.
Thank you. Fantastic. And I'm going to log out. All right, that went really good, I think.
It did. Thank you. They were fantastic questions. Like, it was a real pleasure to have a conversation based in those questions. I think it was great.
Based on it, but we jumped around and went elsewhere. So thank you for being flexible to that. I know, like I said, some people, they want to know exactly what's going to be expected.
Yep.
But thank you for being flexible.
Yeah, no, that's why I wanted to say it ahead of time as well, because I know I've been in interviews where it's like, here's the question and there's the answer, question, answer, and it feels very stilted.